Hello and welcome to this second video on Evangelical Protestantism's descent into hell. This is the second in our series of videos on what has happened to Evangelical Protestantism in the United States. How did it get to the place it's in now? How did it get to a place where it actually supports people who do not support Christian values demonstrably, where it is out for political power, where it displays so little love and so much fear? How did it get to this place? And if you were fortunate enough to see our first video, in that first video, what we did was look at some of the external factors around evangelical Protestantism. So if we look at evangelical communities, what did we see? And we went through those external factors. What I'd like to do this time, though, is a little bit different. We're going to look at the theological factors that have contributed to evangelical Protestantism as it is today. Hi, I'm Dr. Symeon Rodger, and why should you listen to me on this? Well, I functioned as a priest of the Eastern Orthodox Church for about a quarter of a century. I have a doctorate in theology and church history, and yeah, I have a few things to contribute on this whole topic, keeping in mind that Orthodoxy is a completely different type of Christianity from Protestantism or from even Roman Catholicism. Nevertheless, there are some things here that we really do have to look at from a theological point of view. And a lot of these factors have to do with how Protestantism, evangelical Protestantism in the U.S. in particular, has been set up to fail and fall into these traps. So that's what we're going to have a look at right now. And we're looking at it all through the lens of resilience because, of course, what do we deal with on this channel? Human resilience of all types. Now, human resilience includes spiritual resilience, intellectual resilience, and this is where there are some definite lessons to be learned from looking at this massive degeneration of Protestantism that we see in the United States. So the first theological factor I'd like to get into here applies, strictly speaking, to all of Protestantism, but not everybody has fallen equally into all the traps that it brings up. What is this particular factor? This particular factor is what is known historically as sola scriptura. Sola scriptura. So the Bible, the New Testament, and the Old Testament for that matter. Sola scriptura was the Reformation's rebellion against the abuses of medieval Catholicism. Now, if your Reformation history needs a bit of an upgrade, you may remember that in medieval Catholicism there were a lot of abuses going on. The most commonly cited, the thing that people will remember, are papal indulgences, for example. The idea that you could buy your way into heaven or out of purgatory by contributing financially to the church. Right? The Protestants wanted to get away from all of this, understandably, a perfectly sane reaction. But they came up with a principle enshrined in these two Latin words, sola scriptura, only the scripture. In other words, as a religious community, they said the only thing that Christians should pay attention to is the Bible. The Old Testament and the New Testament, that's it. If it's here, we do it. If it's not, we don't. And that was their whole stance. Now, that brought up in itself a number of issues. The first one really is that what you're doing when you do that, and perhaps they were oblivious to this at the time, was you're setting up the scripture, this book, the words on the page, for instance, you're setting this up over and above the community, over and above the church itself. Don't forget the church is people. It's nothing else. It's people. And you're setting this over the church as a kind of constitution or rule book, giving it not only the preeminent place, but the sole place. Now, why is that a problem? Well, an external locus of truth is highly problematic because it takes away from any direct experience, and this is why there's essentially no mystical connection with the divine in Protestantism. This is why the entire mystical life, the entire spiritual life as the ancient Eastern Christians understood it, has disappeared in the West. And this is the reason why you have an external locus of truth. If the truth is here, I need to go to the words on the page to find out the answer. And it's not about my personal experience. It's not about anything I can do. It's not that I can draw closer to God. I simply have to look at this, which leads to a culture of following rules. Do this, don't do that. So it leads to a number of issues. And of course, when you have a culture or a church culture, let's say, that is based only on text, what you end up with are endless interpretations, because I think you'll agree, if you've ever read the Old Testament or the New, you'll realize that isn't entirely clear in a lot of cases. Well, you're right, it really isn't. And because of that, you end up with endless different interpretations, and these endless interpretations mean inevitably you get endless schisms. What's a schism? It's when one community separates from another and stops recognizing it as manifesting the truth of Jesus Christ. So you get this breakdown where, far from having a single Protestant community, you begin to get more and more and more. And yes, sometimes communities will split from each other based on personal factors. That does happen. But a lot of the time it has to do with interpretation. I don't like you, you're a heretic. I think you're wrong. Okay, well, endless schism, and that's what happens. And Protestantism is notorious for that. Absolutely notorious. So why this problem of interpretation? Well, that brings up another factor, which is absence of context. Absence of context. What is context? It's socio-linguistic, cultural. You are very far removed, and so am I, from the cultures that gave rise to this. This is the product of two cultures meeting each other. The Semitic culture and the Hellenic or Greek culture. You do not understand either one, okay? Culture has moved on. Society and civilization has moved on. So we don't have the cultural access we need necessarily to make head or tails of this. We also don't have the linguistic expertise to make heads and tails of this. Do we know what it says? Like, okay, this is a New Testament. Can I open it and find the Greek words? Sure. I have the entire Greek text here. There's a problem. Nobody speaks this language. Even Greeks don't speak this language. They think they understand it. That's a little aside. They do think they understand it, but they actually really don't understand it very well because the entire verb system has changed. Words don't always mean the same thing that they meant back then, and there are new words and different words and old words that have fallen out of use. So basically, nobody speaks this conversationally, which means nobody has a really good grip from that point of view on what is being said. That's inevitable. It's not a showstopper, but it's inevitable. So there are some problems with not having context. Now, for instance, in the Eastern Christian tradition, we derive context from a number of sources. We derive the context from the spiritual community, especially from those who practice the spiritual life more intently. We derive context from that. We derive context from the fact that we spend a lot of our time looking at the literature of that entire period, and that entire period right up to the present time, and looking for the continuity in that or the discontinuity. We derive context. And that context is referred to as tradition. Not tradition in the sense of traditions of men and perversions like indulgences, but simply tradition in the sense of a shared ethos, right? If you have a shared ethos, you can begin to make sense out of this. And that's why most of the questions of interpretation that came up in early times did not come up or didn't come up later, or vice versa. So Protestantism, Protestants today will argue about a lot of things that seemed very clear in ancient times based on a shared ethos and based on the fact this was actually quite well understood by people at the time, linguistically and culturally. And that brings us, of course, to biblical literalism, another big problem. And this is very particular to American Protestantism of really the last couple of centuries. We've seen this building, this drive toward biblical literalism. In other words, everything must be interpreted literally, which also implies that there is one level of meaning for whatever's being said, one level of meaning. Well, the ancient world didn't think that way. The world that authored this did not think that way. They had a completely different idea. These were highly literate cultures. The idea that there could only be one level of meaning, they would have laughed at that, because they knew in the Bible, for example, look, there are symbolic books that are not meant to be treated literally. There are historical books. There are prophetic books. There's all kinds of different literature that make up the Old and the New Testament. And you can't paint it all with the same brush. For example, in the ancient world, if you take the take the book of Genesis in the Old Testament. The book of Genesis is the first book. It's where God creates the world in 7 days. In ancient times, no one ever took that literally. It was always understood to be a symbolic book. So these things are really, really important. Another big problem, of course, is what makes this an inspired text. Well, classically, Protestants will say it was written by God. Oh, dictated by God, you say? That's interesting. And as one Protestant theologian has said, that's essentially a return to the Bible in the spirit of the Quran. Because the Bible in ancient times was never treated this way. It was treated as inspired, but not dictated by God, and there's a huge difference. If it's inspired, you have God, people, text, right? If you take out people, you get God and text. So that's the problem. And if you believe the text is dictated by God, then the problem that arises is this. Which ideas in there are actually relevant right now? And which ideas in there take precedence over other ideas if there seems to be any conflict? What's more important than what? And you have actually no way of determining that if you believe the entire thing was simply dictated by God. In the ancient church, there was a consensus, and that was part of the overall ethos about what's important and what's maybe not so important. You may remember in the first video I talked about the book of Revelation being not really well accepted in the Christian East. Okay, there's an example of a lowered degree of authority. So how do you determine what actually has value? One of the ways that was done, or one of the ways in retrospect we can look at it, go back and look at it, we can look in, for example, in the liturgical life, the life of the services of the ancient church, which still exists in the Christian East. We can look at which passages of Scripture and which books of Scripture were given more airtime and when, because that has a lot to tell us about that. But if you don't have a way of deciding what is more important than what, then you go back to this problem of endless differences of interpretation, and you get lost in that. So all of these problems set you up for pretty much disaster. And if you can pull together enough people who have a very fear-based view of the world, which is what we discussed in the last video, and who have a desire to impose their imagined Christian moral paradise on everybody else, then we have a recipe for a kind of perfect storm. You know, many people will look at evangelical Protestantism and will say, well, as many have said, there's a lack of love there. Yeah, there's a lack of evident love, a lack of evident compassion, and a great deal of fear, a great deal of angst about the outside world. And of course, that's part of that whole persecution complex. Now, to resolve that in your mind, all you have to do is go to the New Testament and look at the words of Jesus Christ himself, or perhaps John the theologian who wrote the book of John and the epistles of John, and who talk about the meaning of love and the relationship specifically between love and fear. So we also find that there is, this, as we've said, this desire to impose your values on other people, the desire to impose what are essentially Puritan values on all of society. Which, yes, some people will say, of course, that's going to lessen the status of women. Definitely it will. It's going to do a lot of other really bad things too. Puritanism has sometimes been talked about as an ideology that is afraid that somewhere, somehow, somebody is having fun, and we have to put an end to that. So this is part of the problem that evangelical Protestantism faces, that it's gotten away from the essential roots of Christianity, the roots of love, the root of compassion that is meant to drive the whole engine. And it wants to postpone that and instead try to impose certain social norms on a society that has long since moved on and has become, in fact, let's say what it is, it's a post-Christian society. However, they will not admit that the fact that we have gone on to a post-Christian society is fundamentally the fault of Christians themselves, of Christianity itself. And that's inevitably the case. And of course, they want to go back to this, as we said, Christian moral paradise that they have in their minds. And part of that is they want to move away from critical thinking. They want to move away from science. They want to move away from social progress. They want to freeze things in time. What this really is a denial of the values of the European Enlightenment. Now, that can be a problem because the entire American Republic is built on the values of the European Enlightenment. In fact, every modern Western democracy is built on those values. What is the Enlightenment? Well, without going into a lot of history, the entire Enlightenment, according to one philosopher, can be reduced to 3 words: dare to understand. Use your mind, ask questions, be open to debate, put it all out there, see what sticks. And if you're afraid of that, I think you have a problem. And I'm saying that as a priest of the Orthodox Church. I think you have a problem. Because ideology, if you've reduced Christianity to an ideology, which is what you are doing here, you are weakening yourself. You're weakening your intellectual integrity. You're weakening your mind. You're setting yourself up for easy manipulation by unscrupulous people and politicians. You're limiting your options for healing yourself because you're limiting your idea of what a human person is. You're limiting your idea of anthropology. And there is no metric under which human society is better without the Enlightenment. Not one. Don't believe it? Then I invite you just to take a look at the parts of the world that never got the Enlightenment memo. And I want you to tell me you'd rather live there. So try that. Anyway, if you found this video informative and helpful, feel free to comment, like, and subscribe. And who knows, there might even be a part 3 for this. I haven't quite decided. Meantime, take care. I'm Dr. Symeon Rodger. We'll see you next time.